Right, we're kind of doing part two of post-colonial India, kind of what happened after the split and this new nation. And so we've already talked about other groups impacted by partition. We haven't talked about Sikhs and how they were impacted. And they have their own religion, but also their own language and region, and they want more power in that region, control within that region, even if they are a smaller group within that region. And so they were largely scattered across the entire Punjab region, but when the split happens, most Sikhs on the Muslim side, the Pakistani side, leave. And so they all go into the Hindu side of the Punjab. And their demands were ignored before, so those demands are going to come back later with a vengeance. Especially because, again, they had 10 million scattered across the region. Now they're going to be concentrated to the Indian side, and they want to have some power over what they have left of the Punjab state. And especially millions had to leave for India when the partition happened. And so after a couple of years, Sikhs are making up 1/3 of this new Indian Punjab, and they're holding high positions in the army, politics, business, and they're really raising in status, and eventually they're going to want more for a separate Sikh state. Their main political party is Akali Dal, which is Army of the Immortals, and they're calling for, again, more control in the Sikh Punjab. And so some are even pushing farther, saying maybe we should have our own country of Khalistan to take back lands from Pakistan and lands from India to form a new Sikh homeland. And so separatists, almost defined as terrorist groups, start to push for a violent revolution to get Khalistan, but that is the fear there. 1955, we get mass demonstrations again calling for more autonomy within their own state. The Indian Army invades the Golden Temple in Amritsar, which was where the government believed was the center of the protest, but also that's problematic when you're invading a religious holy site. And so Nehru just didn't want to divide India up any further. He believed that everybody's going to get along, and perhaps that's a little idealistic. After he dies, and there's no longer opposition from Nehru, then other people are going to move in and they split Punjab up so that Punjab becomes a more Sikh-centered state and they have more power there. This was the result of one of the Sikh leaders fasting almost to death, or at least threatening to, and he gets a separate Sikh state. But there still were extremist groups pushing for more rights and even the possibility of Khalistan. And so after Nehru dies in 64, his daughter takes over and becomes the next prime minister. And so she's prime minister a few times. But again, in response to her worries about Sikh terrorism, she invades the Golden Temple. 500 die in this firefight. And this angers the Sikh community largely, so much so that her own bodyguards, which were Sikh, turn against her and take her down with machine guns. This results in massive anti-Sikh riots afterwards. And so we get a little bit of a animosity towards them. So let's talk about the economy. So this is kind of, everything else was what happened after partition. Now let's look at, okay, what did they do to actually build a new nation? So first off, we have our 5-year plans. And so they take some of the ideas from the Americans and the Brits of capitalism, some of the ideas of communism from the Russians and the Chinese, that they're going to take a little bit of both. Well, largely the Russians, the Chinese were still developing at that point. And so never really liked the idea of 5-year plans and some control of the economy from the government, because Stalin was largely successful in industrializing his nation at a very fast pace, but resulting in huge casualties. And so they start to use 5-year plans where they say, okay, over the next 5 years, we're going to concentrate on this goal. And so they have goals as a nation. They're going to work their government to push those goals. As opposed to capitalism, capitalism is free market, laissez-faire, hands off. And he wants a little bit of a mix. Some capitalist ideas, some communist ideas. And largely the 5-year plans did work in that he's able to increase agricultural production up, he's able to increase industrial production, and so he's able to advance his economy that way. But he's worried that if he opens up to capitalism completely, this would open up Americans and the British coming into with neo-colonialism. The idea that the Americans would just come in and buy up all the land, or the English would come in and buy up all the land, and they would have the power. And the power really wouldn't, the economy wouldn't work for Indians, it'd be working for the Americans that bought up the land. So they had to figure out a way to build their economy without giving away their land to outsiders. And so they do this through high tariffs, that if you want to sell to India, you're going to really have to pay more, and state control of key industries, that certain industries are controlled by the government and no, you cannot buy in. Green Revolution was a major push in India, a major help for their economy. And because agriculture became essential because their population kept going up and they couldn't feed themselves. And so this is where Norman Borlaug, this amazing man, comes up with a new crop. And the issue was many of their crops kept dying off. And so he comes up with a new type of wheat that is able to produce a whole lot more food. And so this American comes up with this new idea of genetically modified seeds. And usually genetically modified organisms get a bad rap. But in this case, this saved the lives of millions by creating a seed. And the issue was their wheat was very tall. When it got windy, it would blow over. So he crossbred Mexican styles of wheat that was shorter and produced more wheat. And so it's able to be more resistant against wind. And so when the winds hit, it doesn't fall over, it stands up and produces more food. And so this genetically modified Mexican smaller wheat does a whole lot better. So thank you, Norman Borlaug, for changing the lives of millions, if not billions of people. And so in the 60s, we get new types of seeds, new fertilizers to produce more. And this really results in people being able to be self-sufficient and feed themselves without the risk of famine that had happened so many times under British rule. But certain regions weren't going to be perfect with this, and that the wealthy farmers are going to be able to produce more food this way. The wealthy farmers are going to have access to these seeds. And so, yes, famine does drop, but it does have issues when it comes to wealth inequality. By the 80s, especially with Russia kind of starting to fall out of their economy, capitalism was embraced a little bit more, and so they start to open up to the possibility of foreign investment and work more. And there's good and bad there for the Americans, in that a lot of the labor is outsourced, so they do get more factories, but that means a lot of factories are leaving places like America. So it's a big boost to their economy when India starts to open up and say, okay, we're going to allow you to buy some land in India and build some factories in India. Education. 1947, they only had 16% literacy, so a really low literacy rate in 1947. And so they started to really push to change this. And they've had some progress in literacy. It has gotten better as far as increasing literacy, but not in compulsory education. They still don't have 100% compulsory, meaning required education. So in America, kids have to go to school. And they're working towards that because they know the benefits of compulsory forcing kids to go to school, but it's still not there yet. It's an issue of poverty that they just still haven't overcome. It's getting better, but they got a ways to go. And they built thousands of schools to provide access. But again, it's still a work in progress. One thing they did really well was they built tons of universities and technical schools because their economy needed to be largely based on science and new forms of agriculture. And so they built that up to have tons of scientists coming out and tons of new technologies. So engineers, and so we almost get this stereotype, and there's a reason for it, of Indian scientists and engineers because they built so many schools and they really concentrated on building up Indian science and engineering. The issue was with their economy not really catching up, a lot of those scientists and engineers left. And so starting in the 1960s, they got a brain drain where they had all the schools, and so they have all these professionals, but their economy wasn't meeting the demands of these professionals. They weren't getting paid what they wanted. And so in many cases, they left. And so we get a wave of Indians leaving to other English-speaking countries. And so waves of Indians moved to England, Canada, Australia, and the United States to this day. And so this also includes medical professionals. And so as a result, for example, Indians are only 2% of the population in America, but they are 20% of medical professionals. And so there's a good chance that your doctor may be Indian. And that's because of this brain drain, because they concentrated so much on science, but the jobs weren't there, and the opportunities weren't there or weren't what they expected. And so we got a lot of movement there. Policies to improve the lives of women. Nehru really pushed for equality, and he did pass several laws to help promote. And so this includes things like allowing for reforms in marriage, including divorce is allowed. Wife-initiated divorce is now allowed, as well as husband-initiated, that was before. Inheritance. So now women are allowed to get inheritance. Before, women were not allowed inheritance. It would have to go to a male. And so that would be the husband or the son would get the inheritance if the parents died. Now it's allowed to be passed on to the woman. But also property rights, that a woman can have her own house, and that can be passed down to her and not her husband or her son instead. And the other major issue that they fought against was the dowry, where families would have to pay for somebody to marry their daughters. And these things did become illegal and the laws did change, but there's been very slow changes because these are challenging long-held traditions. And so dowry is still part of the culture, and there's still issues when it comes to women's rights. And so, yes, it's gotten better in many ways, but again, changing somebody's culture, you can change a law, but changing somebody's mind is so much more difficult. And so they've had slow advancements when it comes to women's literacy and more legal rights, but again, it's not there yet. They're still working. Same issues when it comes to problems of the untouchables, of the Dalit, in that the Constitution gives equal rights. So they have a beautiful Constitution that says everyone's the same, everyone's equal, regardless of religion, race, gender, language, caste, you all have equal rights. And the Constitution can say that, but making that a fact is much more difficult. And so they do set up special funding, kind of an affirmative action of sorts for untouchables, where they are given special opportunities to receive land, housing, healthcare, access to education, and legal aid. And it does help a little bit, but it has not eradicated this idea of untouchability. They even made it illegal to treat somebody different as untouchable. But again, this was not really prosecuted because it's so easy to change it's difficult to change a law. It's very difficult to change a mind. And so much of this discrimination and persecution continues, especially in rural areas where the enforcement is just not there. In the cities, there can be enforcement pretty easily, but in the rural areas, if enforcement is not desired, it is not there. And then health. And so population of 350 million in 1950 with a life expectancy of 32. So a very low life expectancy. That's about half of what the life expectancy for Americans was at that point. Largely this was diseases. Millions are dying from smallpox, the plague, cholera, malaria, and largely these diseases are a result of high populations. When you are jammed together in a large city and you don't have proper cleaning and it's dirty, disease is going to spread more rampantly. And so they came up with a lot of solutions to eradicate these diseases, more vaccinations, more cleaning up the cities, and more doctors. They're building up more hospitals, more clinics to provide vaccinations, provide help with these diseases. And so the death rates of these diseases starts to drop. But that is counterbalanced by, again, the increase in population. So if their population was steady, this would have worked. But combining more doctors with a rapidly increasing population, it just balances out where they're still having the same issues. And so it just puts more pressure. And they have put out a lot of family plans, family planning programs. They have encouraged people to slow population growth with propaganda. They've even given options as far as sterilization, which really angered people. And so they've had little success in lowering the reproduction rates. And so these numbers are going to get higher and higher and higher. And so you can kind of see the chart when it comes to their numbers. it's already outpaced China because China had their own programs, and that's another bucket of worms. And so it's problematic in that their numbers are increasing and it's just not sustainable. And when it comes to they're able to fix one issue, but these other issues keep popping up because of increased population. Foreign crises. So during the Cold War, this big fight over the planet over communism versus capitalism, Nehru decides, no, not going to pick a side. He really becomes a leader in the non-alignment movement, and he brings along these other countries in blue saying, we're not going to pick a side, we're not going to play your game of capitalism versus communism. He's hoping to keep balance between the two. He remains in the British Commonwealth, but he rejects a lot of the British ideas, and so he remains friendly with the English. But again, it's not going to follow everything they want when it comes to capitalism. And he becomes one of the main leaders and champion of fighting against colonialism, fighting against racism. But he didn't want to pick sides. He liked some ideas of communism, some ideas of capitalism. He's not going to choose one team or the other. One of the major fights was along their border with China. And that for a while they had a good relationship as neighbors because they have the same issues of dealing with a legacy of colonialism, dealing with issues of poverty, of trying to industrialize, of having a large population. And so they created treaties to promote trade, to recognize each other's rights. But then they started to grow and they started to become a little competitive as far as who is going to be the dominant nation of Asia. And then there was a major issue when it came to the Dalai Lama, in that 1959, China invades this region of Tibet. And so they take over and say, this Tibet is China. This is no longer independent. It never was. China controls Tibet. And the leader of Tibet was the Dalai Lama, kind of a religious leader, a Buddhist religious leader. And his worry was if he stays, they're going to kill him. And so he decides to leave and continue to spread awareness to the world that he wants his nation back. He wants Tibet to be independent. And so he crosses the border into India, and India grants him political asylum. And that is where he has been ever since. He's still alive today, waiting to return to Tibet. And that is a whole other big story that I'm not going to get into. But this does anger and kind of puts a lot of tension because China wants this guy and because they see him as trying to stir up trouble in this region that they just annexed. And so there is a short war in 1962 over these kind of regions striped there. A very short war, and China gets one chunk of land and India gets another chunk of land at the end of this fight. And that's it for that.